Library, and we're here also taking the census, which is very important. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, as well as voter registration, right? We have to vote. In order for our voices to be heard, in order to make a difference, we seriously have to get those voter registrations in and talk to one another about the importance. I know there's a lot of stigma, a lot of fear, and that's part of why we're here today. So first, with further ado, we have an amazing poet. Her name is Imani, and she is the hippie mommy. As a writer, a conscious mommy, a yogi, an autism advocate, yes, she's super awesome. She's also a blogger who takes on many roles, like majority of Hispanic mamas, right? She is a New York native and a single mother raising her 4-year-old son, Jude, who is on the spectrum of autism. She created her blog, The Hippie Mommy, for mothers who read package labels and live life mindfully and with meaning. That's the new wave, everybody. It's a safe place to talk all things autism as she shares her and Jude's journey of health, mindfulness, and healing. Please give a round of applause for our poet for today, Imani. Hello?
Hey, we're on. Hello, everyone. My name is Imani. Thank you, Rose, for this opportunity. I'm going to start off with a poem I wrote. It's called Spanglish. My skin is royal as it glistens in the sun, hues of gold, amber, yellow, and brown. My hair is my crown, though I suffered years of taming it, colonizing my curls till straight and fine, staying far away from water to prevent unleashing the tame mane. My accent is what the elders would call gringa, because I don't speak Spanish, though if you prick my brown skin, I bleed of sazon and sofrito and sweat adobo out my pores. I don't speak Spanish, but I know just enough to order at the cuchi frito and spare a moment of judgment from the cashier at the counter. I don't speak Spanish, but still I enjoy reggaeton, salsa, can dance a little bachata. But this brown girl enjoys old 70s rock and 90s grunge, in which my peers growing up would call that white people shit. I don't speak Spanish, but Bustelo is the only coffee I know. Hot and strong, and the smell introduces me in the rooms I haven't entered in yet. Though I may never perfect my tongue to roll the R's in arroz, I wait to hear the whispers of my ancestors say, "That's enough," when I'm adding adobo to my sancocho. I don't speak Spanish, but I love in Spanish. Passionate and sensual like the TV novellas that filled my abuela's bedroom walls. My curves do dips like the hills in Puerto Rico. My hips resemble a bottle of mata soda. My lips pout naturally like a quesito pastry. I don't speak Spanish, but I sure cry in Spanish. Nothing is without passion. Nothing is half-assed. I'm not less than because I don't speak Spanish. I'm not less than because I'm half Puerto Rican and half black. I don't speak Spanish, but I lack no intensity. My chicken is still seasoned. My curls is my crown. My Bustelo coffee in my mug is something spiritual. I don't speak Spanish, but I know a cup of coffee is a part of stories, generations, gossip with mom, fellowship with the family, late night conversations, early morning commutes to big city dreams. I don't speak Spanish, but my ambition sure does. It's the fuel that opens doors not meant for a brown Spanglish girl like me. Thank you. And this is my first time, so thank you for the energy. Really, I feel so welcomed and really blessed. Thank you. And thank you. We are one, Patty, Jose, Nancy.
Thank you, Imani. That was incredible. Thank you. want to thank, even though we don't have Bustelo on site, yes, it is the main coffee of Hispanics, we do have Bougie Brew on site behind you, and they are serving free coffee and pastries. Thank you so much, Bougie Brew, for being here today. We also have the Blacksmith Building, who did an amazing job helping us set up the social distancing of this land, and among other things, they have an amazing Airbnb, and they're also building, they look into the historical buildings of Yonkers and renovate them, which is incredible. So thank you, Blacksmith Building. So now we're going to go into the main feature of today. We want to be mindful of their amazing time. This was a complete coincidence, call it universal, but today marks the 3rd anniversary of one of the most devastating hurricanes to ever hit Puerto Rico, Hurricane Maria. And what our author talk has brought to the table for not just Puerto Ricans, but also Hispanics, is he created a voice that is being integrated and immersed into, hopefully, DC Comics. Do I have that right, Edgardo? No? One day we will be there, though. And that's the point, right?
I'll get into that later.
Okay, he'll get into that later. So I'm going to introduce to you Edgar Miranda-Rodríguez, who has been doing amazing things across the board with his new graphic novel, Borinqueña.
Thank you.
Thank you, Edgardo.
You're welcome. 1, 2. Am I on? Yes. I am on. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's a lot warmer in the sunlight, that's definitely for sure. I'm very happy that I was invited by the Yonkers Public Library to come here today to help kick off and celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. This is an important time for us to not only celebrate our heritage, but for those outside of the Latinx community to recognize and celebrate our heritage as well. As many of us know who are here today, who are Latin, whether we be Puerto Rican, Cuban, Dominican, Honduran, Salvadoreño, Panameño, we celebrate our heritage 365 days of the year. We don't wait for, the middle of September to the middle of October to say, oh my God, soy muy hispano, déjeme regalar la ceja y ponerla a Bad Bunny en mi iPhone. No, we listen to our music, we cook our sofrito, we bring our family together, we speak our broken English, broken Spanish, but we hug and we love as Latin people all year round. But this month is important because this is an opportunity for the rest of the country, the rest of this state, the rest of Yonkers to recognize that we're also here. It's an opportunity for all of us to celebrate what it means to be Latin here in Yonkers, here in the United States, here in the world. I'm very happy to be here today. As Rose added during her introduction, today is actually an important day because it's the 3rd year anniversary of Hurricane Maria. And when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico 3 years ago today, it was a storm that pretty much took everybody by surprise. Of course, they were aware that there was a storm on the horizon, but the island was already recovering from Hurricane Irma, which many people tend to forget about. Hurricane Irma hit Puerto Rico just 2 weeks before. And many people were saying, oh, Puerto Rico was fine. But really wasn't. Because the town of Loíza, which is historically recognized as the center of Afro-Puerto Rican heritage on the island, was hit very hard. Vieques, one of the sister islands of Puerto Rico, was also hit very hard. They were still recovering. And when Hurricane Maria came just 2 weeks after, it was a devastating storm, as many of us realized. And that storm, that Category 5 storm, led to over 3,000 lives lost. It also led to the longest recorded blackout in the history of the United States. Almost 11 months, Puerto Rico was without power. Think about that for a second. What does that mean? How many of you freak out when you can't find your smartphone? Or when you're out and your battery dies on your phone. You're like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Multiply that by 1 million when you don't have anything. No power for your refrigerator, for many of us who may have to keep our insulin or other medications refrigerated. No power to find out what's happening in the news. Let alone what's happening in your neighborhood, but just what's happening. when we were finally able to be in touch with our family in Puerto Rico, they either came to stay with us here in the United States or chose to weather the storm. But when they did come, they started learning about what the real impact of the hurricane was when they came here. And they started watching videos on YouTube. The magnitude of the storm was unfathomable for those who were literally living on the island. They saw the immediate impact in their community, in their neighborhood. They had no idea the devastation that had hit the entire island. And what did we do? What did we do? Now, for those who don't understand, some brief history about Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is and continues to be the oldest colony in the United States. It is a territory of the United States, and it is presently at 122 years. Each day it continues to grow to become the oldest colony of the United States. Puerto Ricanos on the island are U.S. citizens, but they're second-class citizens. Why? Well, because in just over 40 days, we're about to participate in one of our most historic elections in this country. An incredible election that we all have to make sure that we are lining up for or mailing in our ballots for. An election that will determine the livelihood for many of us. Pero in Puerto Rico, those 3 million citizens on the island cannot vote for President of the United States. They can vote for the primaries. They have an elected official that represents them in Washington, but that elected official is not allowed to vote either. I like to use the analogy of being presented a menu at a banquet, and you're offered a seat at a table, and you show up, dressed up, and you're sitting there, and you get to see everybody else eat, and you're sitting at your table with nothing to eat. You know what's on the menu, and you're not allowed to actually participate in that meal. And that's what Puerto Ricanos on the island have been going through for the last 122 years. But there are just not Puerto Ricanos living in the island of Puerto Rico. Where there are close to 2.8 million in Puerto Rico right now, there are over 6 million living across the United States. Total, that's 9 million. That's an incredible number. Think about it. Twice the population of Puerto Rico lives in the United States. Can you imagine if other countries had twice the population of their country living in our country? So when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico 3 years ago, it was the diaspora. And when we talk about the diaspora, we refer to people that are connected to the island, but throughout the world. Not just specifically living in Puerto Rico. So when you look at the diaspora, we're talking about Puerto Ricanos from Chicago, from Austin, Texas, from San Diego, from Orlando, Florida, from Yonkers, from Brooklyn, from across the United States, stepped up, took responsibility on their own. They didn't wait for any elected official, for any government officials. They stepped up. Of course, there was a FEMA presence, but there was an urgency that many of us felt, and we started taking our Puerto Rican flag for granted. Yeah, we wave that flag. Some of us tattoo it on our arms. Some of us have it hanging on our rearview mirror. But we started recognizing that being Puerto Rican was more than just having that flag visible. It meant that we needed to do something to help. And we did our part. Here I was at the New York Comic Con with a brand new comic book that I just put out in an effort to raise awareness and to raise a little bit of money. But I wasn't thinking in the grander scope that would become the project today. I'm at New York Comic Con dealing with hundreds of people just 2 weeks after Hurricane Maria. And people still had not heard from their families. But think about it. It's not just Puerto Ricanos that were worried about their families. Think about everyone that is connected to Puerto Ricans. The poet who performed, she's clearly stated that she is of African American and of Puerto Rican heritage. Many of us are of Dominican or Puerto Rican heritage, or Irish and Puerto Rican heritage, or Filipino and Puerto Rican. So our family extends beyond the Puerto Rican lineage. And that also includes our friends and our neighbors. So many people were worried, what's going to happen to Puerto Rico? And here I was with a table just like this, and hundreds of people came to me. They didn't come to dress up as their favorite superhero and show off their costume. They didn't come to get into a debate about which superhero was faster or stronger with me. They asked me, have you heard from your family? I haven't heard from anybody. Have you seen any pictures? Have you seen the news? Have you seen what they've been showing us? It was an incredible moment. It was not a Comic-Con for those days for me. It was a shared space where I was able to bring people together, hug, cry, open up. And one of those people that came to my table was the publisher of DC Comics, Dan DiDio, Italian-American, but his wife was Puerto Rican. And he was worried about Puerto Rico because he was worried about his wife's family. And he came to my table. One of the busiest men in the comic book industry comes to my table because he was hearing about this Puerto Rican superhero. So in this space of like worrying about Puerto Rico, he sat at this event, he's like, well, let's find out what this Puerto Rican superhero is about. But I didn't take that as an opportunity to say, I've got the best Batman story you've ever seen. Wait until you hear this Wonder Woman story. No. When Dan DiDio came to me of DC Comics, I told him, what are we going to do for Puerto Rico? I took that opportunity to immediately come up with an idea. And that idea manifested into a project that will become a book that brought together over 200 comic book artists and celebrities. Comic book artists, if you're familiar with films like Sin City, like Frank Miller, or celebrities like Rosario Dawson, or if you love salsa music like Rubén Blades, all of these artists came together to work on this book. And it became a #1 bestseller on Amazon for 4 months straight. It almost raised close to $250,000 in sales, and 100% of that went towards what my wife created, the La Borinqueña Grants Program. And we became the first independently published comic book series that was intrinsically linked, directly linked with charity. Now, comic books are all about social justice. Fight the bad guy, win over these villains, save the communities, right? And you listen to these stories, you watch them on the screens, you pick up the comic books, you play them in video games, and then that's it. And what we're really doing in reality is contributing to these corporations that are creating these stories. And yeah, every now and then when a movie does really well, they'll write a check and they'll give it to a charity. But nobody creates stories around social justice that connect it automatically to social justice. And that's what we decided to do from the very beginning. If we were going to create a comic book called La Borinqueña, named after the national anthem of Puerto Rico, which is based on the original name of Puerto Rico, Borinquen, then our project had to give back. I look at it as a licensing fee. We're using the name La Borinqueña. The licensing fee goes to the people of Puerto Rico through our charity work. My wife, Kyung, created our grants program. Over the course of 3 years, we have awarded grants totaling $165,000 to grassroots organizations across the island of Puerto Rico. Organizations committed to sustainable farming, organizations committed to women's health and reproductive rights, organizations committed to literacy and arts and education, organizations that fight to preserve and celebrate Afro-Puerto Rican heritage. Because yes, in the Latin community, we have prejudice. We have colorisms. It's incorporated into our lexicon. Ay, mejorar la raza. Ay, pelo bueno, pelo malo. The level of ignorance and hate that's already embedded in our culture, we need to look at ourselves. We can't just always point outside of our community. Oh, esa gente. No, nosotros. Nosotros. So when we created La Borinqueña to be an Afro-Puerto Rican superhero, that was very intentional. Why? Because most public images, most mainstream images of Latin people tend to be lighter complexion than me. Heck, our most famous celebrities, once they become more celebrities, for some reason, something happens to the color of their hair and it gets blonder and blonder and blonder. I don't know, it must be something about the pixels on the television screen with the 4K that's making people's hair turn blonder, you know? Absorbing these European standards of beauty and denying their indigenous standards of beauty, their African standards of beauty. But not only denying that, but looking down on it. Oh, I can't wear my hair natural, I gotta get it straightened. You know, oh, it's a nariz. Ponte un cantor aquí para que se te vea más delgada la nariz, you know? All of these different things. So all of this went into creating La Borinqueña. Yes, it's a superhero comic book. Of course it is. Because we live in an era where people love and enjoy superhero culture. It's everywhere. Caramba, there's probably some young people in here. I know my son is wearing superhero underwear. It's everywhere. On our cereal boxes, video games, on our phone apps, on our t-shirts, on our watch list on Netflix. You know? So when we wanted to do something to raise awareness around Puerto Rico, we said, let's make it into a comic book. And when we decided to create a superhero's origin story, well, something to be known about comic books, most of them are based on Greek, Roman, Norse mythologies. The Bible inspires many superheroes. Superman is inspired by Moses. He was created by two Jewish American writers and artists. So when we created our character, they said, well, we have our own spirituality. We have our own mysticism and mythologies. And in researching this project, this series, I started recognizing the intrinsic, powerful feminist energy that's always been in Puerto Rico. The original name of Puerto Rico is Borinquen. That's a Taino word. The Tainos were the indigenous peoples of many parts of the Caribbean, from Cuba to the Bahamas, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Jamaica. In fact, just a few years ago, the Smithsonian Institute put out a study that a Taino tooth was found in a cave in the Bahamas. And then when they found this tooth, they were able to create the first DNA genetic marker for Taino people. I know this for a fact, personally, because I did a 23andMe. And I did it a year or two before that study came out. And when my DNA came back, it listed African DNA, it listed European DNA, and it listed North American, Native American DNA. It was a very broad Western Hemisphere. And I was like, caramba, that's like the whole side of the planet. But when this DNA marker for Tainos came in, my DNA was updated. And for the first time, when I looked at my DNA information, it said Taino. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's it. That's the validation. That's where my part of who I am comes from. So the original name of Puerto Rico was Borinquen. And it's a Taino word. And the word means land of the noble creator, land of the valiant creator. But we live in a patriarchal society, so many people understood that creator meant a male god, a male deity. But what people neglected to understand is that creator by Tainos was actually a woman, a feminine goddess called Atavex. And Atavex had two twin sons, Yucahu, the gods of the mountains and the seas, and Huracan, the gods of the elements and the storms. And wait a minute, Huracan, it means hurricane. So the actual word hurricane comes from the Tainos. So when we created La Borinqueña, all of this history was important. And I started recognizing, look at all of this history and the role and the significant place that women had in this history and how it's been overlooked and erased. From the first powerful imagery of Atavex. And as I started uncovering more history, I learned more. I learned that Mariana Bracetti was part of a revolution in 1868 to overthrow the Spanish Empire, and she created Puerto Rico's first Puerto Rican flag in a revolution that was called El Grito de Lares, the outcry of Lares. And after that revolution, Mariana Bracetti was incarcerated. Many people were in exile. Another very important woman of that era, Lola Rodríguez de Tio, wrote the lyrics to the first national anthem of Puerto Rico, La Borinqueña. Did not mention Christopher Columbus admiring and thinking of Cuba. Lola Rodríguez de Tio was exiled to Cuba, where she lived her last days. And Meterio Betances and a few other Puerto Ricans found their way in New York City. And 125 years ago, this flag was the second attempt to overthrow the Spanish Empire, because this flag was created in New York City. There were 59 Puerto Rican members of the Cuban Revolutionary Party that would meet periodically at the Chimney Corner Hall on West 25th and 6th Avenue in Manhattan. And they came together to create an idea, of bringing all of the Antillean islands together, La Confederación Antillana, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic. That's why our flags were so similar. And the second flag was going to be created. And it was created also by a woman. The idea was created by men, but it was a woman who sat down with the fabric, Maria Manuela Besosa, and she sewed this flag. That flag that was waving, first waved 125 years ago, and it made its way into Puerto Rico, and existed in Puerto Rico. And then in 1948, La Ley de la Mordaza, a law was created that outlawed that flag. Oh yeah, this flag was illegal. And that original song that was written, the original national anthem written by Lola Rodriguez de Tio, that was also illegal. In fact, waving this flag, having this conversation that I'm having right now, creating a superhero with these flag colors, was illegal. And many Puerto Ricanos were incarcerated, were fined up to $10,000 because of this law, in an attempt to suppress any conversation about independence. And the independence of Puerto Rico started against Spain. But at this point, there was an attempt to bring the United States into Puerto Rico's identity, into Puerto Rico's space. And in 1898, Puerto Rico was invaded by the United States. And in this space, there was a governor, Luis Muñoz Marin, who was the one who instituted the law, the gag law. But the United States stepped in and said, you know, if we're making Puerto Ricanos U.S. citizens, then they have freedom of speech. You can't have this law on your own people. This is illegal. So the law was overturned. And in 1952, the flag of the Commonwealth was unfurled. But it was the exact same flag with a navy blue triangle. So if you see these flags and you wonder why there's so many different shades of blue, is it that flag was out too long in the sun and it faded? No. And what happens? In 1952, a new version of La Borinqueña was written. And it commissioned a Spaniard lyricist. And that was the one that many of us, I know I did, grew up here in New York City, in New York State, learning that song alongside that Star Spangled Banner, alongside Lift Every Voice and Sing. And I would sing every morning about how awesome Christopher Columbus thought our beaches were in Puerto Rico. I think that's probably the only national anthem that gives a name drop to someone who's not even of the country that you're actually celebrating and you're singing. And so all of this history came together to create this project, a philanthropic project, an educational project, a superhero comic book. That's where all of this comes from. And inspired by these women that were part of this history, I've been inspired and I've been raised by feminists that have made me the man that I am today. Iris Morales, one of the original members of the Young Lords Party, Dr. Marta Manolo Vega, who founded El Museo del Barrio and the Caribbean Cultural Center and still continues to work in Puerto Rico and Afro-Puerto Rican heritage movements, shaped me to become the man that I am. And I take my male privilege and I take my light-skinned privilege to bring these conversations across the United States, not just here in Yonkers, but in universities, in public schools, in libraries, in art galleries, in museums. Museums like the Smithsonian Museum that actually had our costume on display, that actually has our comic book as part of their permanent collection, and actually has created curriculums around our comic book. And we continue to do this work. We share in this space that we are here today to bring history to light, to bring culture to light, to celebrate, and to recognize that we have an innate superpower. As Latin people, we are now the largest ethnic group in this country. The first time in the history of the United States. But what does that mean if we don't exercise our power to vote? What does that mean if we don't actually mobilize to create our own elected officials so that we can actually have a voice in Washington? Power isn't only in the executive branch. We need to have representatives in Congress as well that represent our values. And that's where the power really is. It's in all of us. Many of us have fought for this right.
Well, guys,
many of us have died.
as you see, the activity is going to go from now from 12 noon until around 7 p.m. 29 Warburton Avenue. Come on down, participate. It's going to be an art show. It's going to be some Latin jazz at La Bella Havana from 5 to 7. So come on down and enjoy it.
Use that
make this
superpower.
part.
Thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, feel free to raise your hand, speak up loudly, because we're all social distancing, obviously, because you got to speak up a lot louder. But, yes.
So, 2 weeks after the hurricane, the comic book was initiated. What's the timeline?
Okay, cool. So the timeline, the first issue of La Borinqueña was released in December of 2016. And then 9 months after that issue, I did my first official Comic-Con appearance. But that was also 2 weeks after Hurricane Maria. So after Hurricane Maria, I met with DC Comics. And just so we clarify, because Rose alluded to something that was incorrect, so I wanted to correct that. We are actually an independently published comic book series. So DC Comics came to me and they gave me permission to use all their characters for free in my own comic book. So when you look at this comic book, the one that we did with DC Comics, and you see Wonder Woman on the cover, and you see Superman on the cover, you don't see the DC Comics logo anywhere. What you see is my studio's logo, Somos Salte, because these superheroes are actually making a guest appearance in my comic book of La Borinqueña, and it's not the other way around. So La Borinqueña continues to be an independent comic book. So after Hurricane Maria, this book was released in May of 2018. So that's how that timeline works. Good question, thank you.
I have a question. Can you tell us a little bit about the evolution of Puerto Rico? It's the comic book that you just picked up. It's PR Struction, right? So this came about as an evolution of Comic-Con, right? When you were at Comic-Con, it started to brew. Can you tell us a little bit about that evolution and how it impacted you moving forward when you created this? Because you are actually the writer, the graphic designer. So tell us a little bit about PR Struction.
So La Borinqueña started with this book. This book was released in 2016. La Borinqueña as a character was announced when this image on the back went viral. Because in May of 2016, I announced that I wanted to make a comic book at a press conference because the Puerto Rican Day Parade was going to honor me that year in the summer of 2016. And we debuted our character at the parade on an actual float, a young woman who had just graduated from law school, dressed up as La Borinqueña, and we didn't even have a comic book yet. The comic book wouldn't come out for another 6 months. That's December of 2016. So that's when the first book was released. This is the book right here that I'm holding in my hand. It's in libraries across the United States, and it's actually a part of the permanent collection of the Smithsonian Museums in Washington, D.C. And when I did Comic-Con, that would be October of 2017, 2 weeks after Hurricane Maria, I only had this one book. And so DC's publisher at the time, Dan DiDio, came to my table. And out of that conversation that we had, I immediately came up with the idea and the name Reconstruction. The idea of reconstruction meaning like to kind of like come together and rebuild something. But I see the word Puerto Rican in that. So that's why I renamed it Reconstruction. Also as an homage to an amazing salsa musician and artist who had an album of the same name in the 1970s. Ray Barreto had an album called Reconstruction. And there was also an incredible punk rock, Puerto Rican punk rock group in the 90s that also called themselves Reconstruction. So it's a word that's been around in our community for generations, and I was the first one to use it in the comic book genre. So Reconstruction would become a book with over 200 artists that contributed to it. Artists that were not just only Puerto Rican, African American, Asian American, Caribbean American, white artists, European artists, like literally artists who wrote and drew straight from Europe, or artists who literally drew from the Middle East. We had artists internationally. Because of the internet, I was able to connect with artists all over the world. So artists all over the world contributed to get this book done, and they all contributed for free. And DC Comics gave me permission to use their artists for free, and to use any of their characters for free. So I was able to write a Wonder Woman story. I was able to write a Batman story. But what was important about this wasn't the fact that, oh my gosh, look at all these cool superheroes. It's that in their 80 years of being written, never once had any of these superhero characters in their comic books ever been to Puerto Rico. So the first time they all come to Puerto Rico, the first time was in this book. Here's a little scientific nerdy moment I love. In Puerto Rico, we have a native parrot called the iguaca. That's the scientific name, the iguaca, right? The iguaca also is known as the Amazon. So my story is about Wonder Woman meeting Puerto Rico's Amazon. So it's one Amazon meeting another Amazon. Another nerdy moment in this book, Puerto Rico has its own species of bat. Puerto Ricensis is actually part of a story that I wrote. Puerto Ricensis terrenotus is the scientific name for this Puerto Rican bat. And it's part of a story that I wrote with Batman. So even in these stories, I tried to bring in scientific, historic, cultural moments that were Puerto Rican, because I knew that this book, even though this was my second book, I honestly knew that this book wasn't going to get to everybody. But I knew that this book was. So I knew that this book was probably going to be the first introduction that many people had to my character, but also the first introduction that many people were going to have to Puerto Rico. So this book needed to be that. It wasn't going to be the ultimate guide to Puerto Rico. What I was hoping is that it would be the introduction, that you would read this and say, well, I want to learn more. Maybe there are other books out there I should read. And believe me, I get that all the time. People read our books and like, what else can I read? Do you have a bibliography? Can you refer some other books? And then people visit. Where can I go to Puerto Rico? And what I tell people is, when you go to our website, la-borinquena.com, we list all the organizations that we support through our grants program. And one of the things we encourage people is that when you want to visit Puerto Rico, find out about these organizations we support. Find out how you can volunteer while you're in Puerto Rico. If it's a library that's in the Pueblo of Mariana in Humacao, you can put together books and donate it to their library. If it's arts, then you can participate in an arts program in the Boys and Girls Club across the island of Puerto Rico. If it's engaging in actual wildlife protection, then you can go to Culebra and participate with these young people that call themselves the Reef Guardians that work to preserve and protect the coastline of Puerto Rico. So that's where the ideas, and that's how that book manifested. And that book really was what gave us the financial resources to really start a philanthropic work. But it was just such an incredible success, and since DC Comics gave us a free license to use their characters, and we were able to keep 100% of the proceeds, we immediately started our grants program. And my partner, Kyung, is the executive director of our grants program. And we've been successfully running our